Now that we have our hair in place that we created off of those curves, let's take a look how we can start changing the visual style of this hair. And I don't necessarily mean just the shape, but the color as well. So I'm going to go ahead and select my hair system right there, bring up my attribute editor, and I can go ahead and close that off to give ourselves a little bit more space. So I'm okay for the most part on the settings for the clump and hair shape. I may come back here later to make some adjustments. For right now, I'd actually like to come down over here to shading and displacements. So let's go to shading first. This is where we can adjust to our color. Now this will change a little bit later depending on what kind of shader we use, but for now it absolutely adjusts our color. And you can even see that there's a hair color scale associated with it. Basically the left hand side is the root, the right hand side is the tip, and it multiplies against the color. So if I go ahead and, for example, let's bring this forward here, grab this one here and darken this, you should see the roots begin to get darker. You could see that right there. And of course, if I go ahead and bring that out, you could see that coming in over there. So it's a nice way to both give darker root color as well as to give almost kind of the hint of some shading or shadow. I'm going to go ahead and lighten that up just a little bit. And I might bring this out a little bit further there. And I'm probably going to adjust my color maybe to be a little bit brighter. Ultimately, I'm going to want to stick with gray hair because that's what I want this to be. But for now, I'll leave a little bit of color. Now, we do have opacity, which controls the opacity of the hair. You won't see this in the viewport, though, only in the render. The translucence is how much the light passes through the hair. So, again, you won't see too much change in the viewport, if at all. Depends on your video card. We can control the specular color, and that would be the highlight there, as well as the specular power. You can see a low power is going to give us a much broader highlight, while a high power is going to give us a very small, tight highlight. So I'm going to go ahead and soften that out a little bit there, and maybe bring it down. He wouldn't have too much highlight on that kind of hair. You can see it is casting shadows. And if we come down here, we also have the ability to use color randomizations. Now I'll come in a little bit closer for this. Now you can see by default there is already diffuse and specular randomization, and you can see that without that the hairs look a little boring. As soon as we up the diffuse, you can see how we do get some random tones in there. And this doesn't have to just be diffuse or specular. We can also randomize the saturation, which you can see can actually give us gray hairs, and the value as well, which you can see can give us some pretty intense values. Now you could also, if you wanted to, randomize the hue. However, you're going to get clown hair pretty quickly there. However, there are some uses for this. I'm going to keep that off, and I'm just going to add a little bit of value randomization, saturation, and I'm ultimately, like I mentioned earlier, going to go with some gray colored hair over here. So I'll go ahead and do something like that. Okay, and we'll keep the roots a little bit darker the way they are now. Maybe that's a little too dark. Maybe we'll lighten that just a touch. Right there, and maybe we'll lighten this a little bit. Okay, so we have our gray hair there, and you can see how much these affect it. So I can get darker hairs in there, just get some much nicer values. So that looks pretty good. Now what we can deal with next, let me close off shading over here, is displacements. Now displacements are not going to affect each tendril or each clump of hair, it's going to affect each individual hair. So for example, I can add curl. Again, I'll zoom in on this a little bit, and you can see as I increase the curl, I start to get some curling in the hair. Now I can even increase the frequency, and you'll see that I can start to get some really small details. Now if I go too far, you notice the hair flattens out again. You have to be careful and make sure there are enough segments in your hair. If you find there's not enough, you have to come up here to clump and hair shape and increase the segment count. You can see if it's low, you don't see any shape at all. If I bring it very high, you can start seeing a lot of fine shape in there. So I don't need it too high though. I want a little bit of curl. Maybe just like a general little kind of wave in there. I can also work with noise. You can see there's random noise that can be added, and just adds a little bit of randomness in there. Notice it's not very strong. I can also come in here and change the frequency of that noise, so a higher frequency will give me a lot more of it. However, I can also change it to not just be random per hair, but I can base it on the UVs of my head, and you can see that's going to be way more intense, but it also gives me a lot more to work with. So I can bring this down here. I can work with detail levels and individual axes, the U, V, and W. And all of this can give you much more unique noise. You can also base it on the clump UVs, which would be the individual clumps, not just the individual hairs. So I'm going to stick probably with this surface UV noise here. I think that looks pretty good. It's maybe a little too messy, so I might turn that down to about 0.05. But there, I kind of like that. Now what we also have down here is subclumping, and what this can do is create the appearance of hairs beginning to stick together to create little clumps. That can happen when hair is wet or when hair is dirty. And even just randomly as well. I mean, you see it all the time in animals. So I'll go ahead and increase the subclumping, and you could see how I start to get these kind of little formations. Now at the moment I'm getting 15 clumps in the U and 15 clumps in the V. So I can go ahead and increase that if I want to, maybe 30 and 30. Something like that. And you can see now I have so many clumps I don't really see them anymore, but I could also take it down low to maybe 4 and 4, and now that becomes far more visible. And you can almost see how they kind of grow out of the head there. And that actually works really well for this kind of hair, I think. Now, this doesn't have to be based just on surface UVs. We can base it on clump UVs as well, and that'll give you a different look. I'm fine with surface UV though. So we also have displacement scale over here, and this will allow us to turn off the displacements overall. You can see it goes completely off. Or we could do something like add a point here and say there's a lot of displacement towards the tip, but less displacement towards the base. So that's a quick look at how we can change some of our basic shading settings and working with our displacement settings.